All right, so we are going to take out your notes, please. Turn off your phones. Take out your AirPods, earbuds, please. All right, so we are going to start talking about basically human reproduction, including reproductive, anatomy, functions, human embryonic birth and development. Talk a little bit about contraception as well, sort of all those sorts of topics. And that's going to move us into our discussion of genetics. So we'll start just with some definitions. It's important for us to understand what all these different terms mean, and sometimes they can be confusing, and things are more complicated than typically you may have learned in like seventh grade, right? In seventh grade in life science, when they talk about sex, they talk about sort of sex chromosomes and sort of leave the discussion there. But we know really today things are much more complicated in terms of biological sex. So here's some terms to be familiar with so that we're sure we're using the right terms. First is biological sex. So when we talk about biological sex, this is something that's basically determined when a person is born by a doctor or a nurse. And basically, when a newborn is born in a hospital or somewhere else, the nurse or the doctor looks at their reproductive organs and checks on the birth certificate, male or female. And really, those are the only options on a birth certificate. And so what we know is that sex, biological sex, it's more complicated than that. There's many different conditions that are called intersex conditions, in which a person is born with sex characteristics that are not in the typical male-female checkbox, the binary biological sex definition. So we'll talk about some of the biology behind that as we make our way through this section. And so that's biological sex, right? And that's what's determined sort of at birth just by doctors. But then we have we have also gender identity, which is not the same thing as biological sex. And that's something that sometimes people confuse the two issues. When we talk about gender, and I'll try and use the term gender for gender identity, and I'll try to use the term biological sex for that, because gender identity can be different than sex. Gender identity is a person's own personal sense of their own gender. And it's determined by a person. It could be the same as what is determined biological sex at birth. It might not be the same. And so the terms that we use when a person's gender identity doesn't match with their sex determined at birth by the doctor or the nurse is transgender. And when a person's gender identity does pair up with the binary sex assigned at birth, that's called cisgender people. And so we can use those terms, and there's lots of variation on these. And then that's also separate from sexual orientation, right? And who a person is attracted to, whether it's men or women or another gender or none in particular. So those sort of issues are all kind of different. And it's easy to sometimes mix those up. So wanted to talk about that and be sort of explicit about that, because we know today, and some of our notes we'll learn about this, is that really sex is more complicated. Our most recent research and what doctors know about hormones and chromosomes and genes means that really lots of these characteristics are on a spectrum. And so that's something oftentimes when we talk about it in science class, we don't give it enough attention, because it's easier to just say there's only two sexes. But there is lots of variation that we're going to talk about. And it could be variation in terms of hormones that a person has. There are chromosome variations that people are born with. There are variations in anatomy that people have. So there's lots of different variations when we talk about biological sex. And so these things interact. The hormones a person has interact with the chromosomes that they have, which interacts with their anatomical structures and gonads as well. And all of those things sort of combine to form what we might call secondary sex characteristics that we will discuss, that are what we think about when we might think about typically male or typically female characteristics. So it's the combination of all these things that's important. And this is how complicated sex can be, right? This is like a flow chart that shows sort of what determines these different sexual characteristics. And on the left, what you see as chromosomes, right? The things that probably you learned about in 7th grade. And maybe what you learned about in 7th grade, well, there's XX or there's XY. Well, there's a lot of other things as well. Okay. Then there's the genes that are present on those chromosomes. They also impact sexual characteristics. There are organs that impact sexual characteristics. And then there's the development of those traits through puberty as well. So it's complicated. Okay. We'll talk about some of those things. When we think about, what we might think of typical male and female traits, we're following sort of this left hand or right hand flow chart where a person's born with 2 X chromosomes. They don't have this SRY gene that leads to development of typical female anatomy, which leads to the production of estrogen and progesterone during puberty, which leads to development of female secondary sex characteristics. Or if we look at the opposite side of the spectrum, we have a person born with an X and a Y chromosome, okay, that have this SRY gene, which is found in the Y chromosomes. They develop typical male anatomy and typical male hormones and male secondary sex characteristics. But then we have all this space in the middle. Sometimes a person's born with a single X chromosome. Sometimes they're born with 2 X's and a Y. Sometimes there's a mutation in this SRY gene, which leads to all of these cascading effects, which lead to a whole variety of different places on the spectrum from biological male to biological female. So we're going to talk about first the typical male reproductive system and organs. And a lot of this will probably be review from 7th grade or from health class. So the term gonads is a general term, just like gamete is a general term for it could be sperm or egg cell, any reproductive cell. Same is true of gonads. That could be ovaries, it could be testes, it could be organs in a flower as well that produce gametes. But when we're talking about human reproduction, testes are the typically male gonads, and what they do is they produce sperm cells and also hormone testosterone. And testosterone is a hormone that influences secondary sex characteristics, what we think of as typically male secondary sex characteristics. It also regulates sperm maturation. Okay. And so the testes themselves produce sperm sort of constantly after puberty. And we're talking about differences between ovaries and testes, and that testes produce sperm continuously. And those sperm cells, when they're first produced, what type of cell division produces them? What type of cell division produces sperm cells? And we have 2 options of cell division, which makes sperm cells. We did not just spend a whole block on this to have nobody be able to answer this question. Ash? Thank you. Meiosis, right? Sperm cells have half the number of chromosomes as other typical body cells. They go into a part of the testes that's sort of on the outside called the seminiferous tubules, where they sort of mature. Okay. In the epididymis, they're made in the testes in these seminiferous tubules. They go to the epididymis to kind of mature eventually. And so testes are different than ovaries in that testes are held sort of outside of the body. And there's a reason for that. Sperm cell production works best at slightly cooler than body temperature. So typically our body temperature is 98.6. Sperm actually are produced and mature best a little bit below that. So the testes are outside of the body in the scrotum to keep them slightly cooler than normal body temperature. And during fetal development, testes are typically inside of the body. And then typically soon after birth or right before birth, the testes, they call it, descend and move into the scrotum from inside of the abdominal cavity. Sperm cells themselves, as you know, are the male gamete, sex cell. They're really small, much, much smaller than the female gamete, the egg cell. And so they're produced, like we said, in the testes, mature in the epididymis, and are released from the body during ejaculation. And they travel through, I'll show you the picture in a minute, not the picture, the diagram. They travel through a tube that's called the vas deferens, which goes from the testes up into the abdomen. It merges with the urethra and then out through the penis. So in a single ejaculation, a male can release 40 million to 300 million individual sperm cells. Okay. And they can survive for 24, 48 hours or so. And they are protected and nourished by fluid that's called semen. So along the way, as the sperm cells are on their way out of the body, different glands secrete different materials that are going to help those sperm cells sort of do their ultimate job, which is fertilize the egg cell. And so those glands, probably the one you've heard of is the prostate gland. Why have you probably heard of that more than any other? Yeah, prostate cancer is one of the most common forms of cancer. It affects people with the prostate gland. And for example, my grandfather had prostate cancer. He died from it. My father had prostate cancer as well. So as we talked about, cancer is just our own body cells losing control of cell division and growing, forming tumors. And so sometimes that happens in the prostate gland. And so at a certain age, a person might get their prostate gland checked. They can actually feel if it's enlarged. That's the first sign of maybe a problem, is that the prostate gland is enlarged or may have a lump on it. There's certain blood tests they can do, because when a person starts to develop prostate cancer, there's a certain protein that starts to be produced and found in their blood. So you could go for a blood test and it can tell you if your PSA levels are elevated, because prostate cancer is pretty common. But there's other glands other than the prostate gland, which add fluids to the sperm and the semen. Nutrients are needed because these sperm cells eventually may make the journey to the egg cell. And that takes time, it takes energy. And so these different fluids that are added to the sperm cells are to allow them to do that. And during ejaculation, semen, which are the sperm cells, along with these fluids, are released from the penis. If we look on the right side of this diagram first, this is a single testy. Testicle means the same thing. Terms can be used interchangeably. So the seminiferous tubules are inside of the testy. This is where meiosis is happening. This is where these cells are being produced. They go through little tubes, eventually make their way to the outside of the testy. This is the epididymis. This is where they mature. Okay. Sperm cells have a tail, a flagellum. They have a little sort of motor where there's mitochondria to provide energy for the flagellum so that they can swim. And at the top of the testy is the beginning of the vas deferens. You could see here, the vas deferens goes from the scrotum all the way up into the abdomen. into the abdomen. It makes a big loop around the bladder. Eventually, along the way, here's the seminal vesicle and the prostate gland, which add to those sperm cells, and then eventually merges with the urethra, which is the tube that's going to carry the sperm cells out of the body. Does anyone know the name of if a man wants to not be able to have children anymore? A permanent means of contraception. What is it called? Yeah, vasectomy, and it comes from this term, vas deferens. So basically, in a vasectomy, a doctor makes an incision in the scrotum, finds the vas deferens, basically cuts it, cauterizes to seal both ends. So now a man no longer releases sperm cells in the semen. There's no sperm cells there, therefore they can't make a woman pregnant. So it's a permanent. I mean, they can try to reverse it. So if a person has a vasectomy and then decides, well, actually, maybe I want to have children, they can try to undo it. It doesn't work all the time. There's also kind of rare cases when the two ends of the vas deferens kind of heal and regrow, and then a person could make a woman pregnant because there could be sperm being released in the semen, but it's sort of a permanent means of contraception that sometimes men choose to have.
Isn't it like possible for it to be like reversed?
Yeah, I just said that. Yeah, it can be undone or reversed. Yeah. It's not always. It doesn't always work, but the doctor can try to undo it. Okay. Does anyone know how a person gets a prostate exam? How can a doctor feel if a prostate is enlarged or irregular? Yeah, Jordan? Okay. How?
So the doctor has to stick his hand up your anus.
Not this hand, but a finger. Yeah. And so if you look at the anatomy here, so this is the anus, this is the colon. A doctor can feel if this prostate gland were enlarged, they could feel it just inside of the large intestine, just inside of the colon. So that's what a prostate exam is. All right. So let's move on to female reproductive system. So if we think about the female reproductive system, again, the gonads are the ovaries. So their function. Now, I'm using a different term here, is to release eggs. Not. So you know why I'm using that instead of produce eggs? Yes, the eggs are actually there at birth. No new eggs will be produced in the ovaries throughout a woman's lifetime. They're there already. But what happens is eventually at puberty, they start to mature one or maybe two at a time. So they're in there from birth, all of the eggs that'll be in the ovaries ever. So the ovaries release those eggs. And we'll talk more about the reproductive cycle here in a couple minutes. They also produce hormones. They produce estrogen and they produce progesterone. These are two hormones that are important in regulating the reproductive cycle. Ovaries are inside of the body. There's two of them. Okay, left and a right ovary. They're in the abdomen. They're about 1 inch in diameter. It says all the immature eggs are there at birth. And they regulate the menstrual cycle as well. Those egg cells are the largest cells in the body. They're in the ovaries in these little sort of pockets that are called follicles. And within these follicles, after puberty, one follicle every reproductive cycle starts to mature. And the egg within it starts to mature. Eventually, it then is released. And what's the term for that? What's the term for the release of an egg from an ovary? Ovulation. So ovulation is when that egg is released from the ovary into the oviduct. The egg travels after it's released from the ovary into the oviduct. Another term for that is the fallopian tube. They mean the same thing. Those egg cells, after they're released, move through the fallopian tube into the uterus. And then that's where we'll talk more about if that egg cell does get fertilized, what happens to it. But the uterus is basically a muscular organ that can expand, obviously, when a woman is pregnant. The uterus is where the embryo, where the fetus is going to grow. Okay. Not in the stomach, even though people say that sometimes, like kids, that the baby's in the mommy's stomach. What would it be like in the stomach? Yeah, it'd be like hydrochloric acid, not a great place for an embryo to grow. So it's actually in the uterus. The opening of the uterus is called the cervix. If you have heard about childbirth in movies or for relatives, the cervix, when they talk about dilation, is what opens to allow the fetus to be born. The cervix opens to the vagina. Again, sort of muscular tube that receives sperm during intercourse. Also, it's the birth canal where in a vaginal birth, the baby, the fetus will be born. During intercourse, 200 to 300 million sperm cells are released into the vagina. They then, though, those sperm cells, if they're going to fertilize an egg, they have to make their way from the vagina through the cervix, into the uterus, into the oviduct. That's where they can actually fertilize an egg. So the egg cell gets fertilized in the oviduct. And so of those hundreds of millions of sperm cells, only a few dozen actually reach the oviduct to fertilize the egg cell. Most of them never make it. So if we look at the structures, again, we have ovaries, one on each side, connected to the fallopian tube or the oviduct, same term. Uterus, again, just sort of a hollow muscular pouch that can hold the fetus if it's fertilized. Opening of that uterus is the cervix and then the vagina. So same sort of view over here. What's the equivalent to a vasectomy that a woman might have? A permanent sort of means of birth control or contraception. And so that's something different. So if a woman can have eggs frozen, so where there's a procedure when eggs are removed from the ovaries, immature eggs, and can be sort of stored and frozen. Those eggs can be viable in the future at some time. Why would a woman do that? I mean, I want to know why. Why would someone want eggs frozen? Madison?
One of the girls that I know, she had got cancer, so she froze her eggs so she could have babies after she
Yeah, so that's often. Sometimes if a person has a medical condition in which something might happen to their ovaries. So maybe they needed some sort of radiation treatment, and it could destroy the eggs that are in the ovaries. Or if they had to have their ovaries removed because of a cyst or something else, they could remove the eggs first, and then they could use in vitro fertilization to fertilize them outside of the body and implant them back into a woman's uterus. So she might still be able to have biological children, even if there's a problem with the eggs in her ovaries. Or sometimes a woman might do that because they may not want to have children for an extended period of time, and they want to. And as a woman gets older, there's a larger likelihood of having problems with the eggs. So she might have them frozen early on in her life to be used later on. Darren, did you have something else? Oh yeah. So my original question was about like the equivalent of a vasectomy is it's called tubal ligation. A lot of times people say tubes tied, and basically it's sort of the same thing. So in men, it's the vas deferens is cut and sort of sealed off, so sperm can't leave the body. In females, it's the fallopian tube, so they can do surgery. They can cut these fallopian tubes, seal them off, so that when a woman does release an egg during ovulation, it doesn't have anywhere to go. And there's no way for sperm cells to reach it. So therefore, she can't become pregnant. So it's the same sort of procedure. All right, let's end with the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle is a complex cycle that involves 4 different hormones. And the level of these hormones change over time. And it controls the typical ovulation process that happens after the menstrual cycle starts. So typically we say the menstrual cycle takes about 28 days. That number can vary, be longer, could be shorter, could be irregular. Sometimes that reproductive cycle might stop and the menstrual cycle might stop completely for a period of time. There's all sorts of variations to this, and it's slightly different for each person. Stress, illness, pregnancy, age, all of these things affect the reproductive cycle. But if we think about sort of the typical reproductive cycle, it has different stages. So we'll start with the follicle stage. This will last 10 to 14 days. And this is when inside of the ovary, a follicle is developing. Remember, the follicles are little pockets inside of the ovary that contain an immature egg. And after puberty, once every reproductive cycle, they start to mature. Usually just one, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 or 4, but typically 1 starts to mature. There's a hormone that the pituitary gland makes called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And the name tells you what it does, right? When levels of follicle stimulating hormone in the blood increase, a follicle starts to develop. Okay. That follicle itself also creates a hormone from the ovary, which goes into the blood, creates estrogen. Estrogen is another hormone. Around halfway through the cycle, ovulation happens. So when estrogen is produced from this follicle as it develops, it stops FSH from being produced. And the combination of these signals from these hormones causes the follicle to move to the outside of the ovary, break open, and release a mature egg cell into the oviduct. So it's a combination of these different hormones are the signal to the ovary to do that. Remember, hormones work because they're secreted in the blood. They travel all around the body. And when they get to certain target tissues, they attach, causing something to happen. In this case, they cause the follicle to mature and release the egg cell. After the follicle releases the egg cell, it starts to sort of break down. It's called the corpus luteum stage. As it's breaking down, it creates another hormone called progesterone. And this hormone, progesterone, stops a new follicle from forming. And it maintains the lining of the uterus to be thickened and enriched with blood vessels. Because the lining of the uterus is getting ready for an embryo to implant. That's its purpose, is to support an embryo to develop a placenta if there is an embryo. What if there is no embryo? What if there were no sperm cells to fertilize the egg and there's no embryo? What happens to the lining of the uterus? It sheds. It breaks down eventually. And that's what we call menstruation. That's the menstrual period. That there was no embryo, so the lining was no longer needed, starts to break down, and the lining of the uterus is shed through the vagina. And that's what the menstrual period is. What's one of the first signs that a woman might know she's pregnant? Yeah, not getting the typical menstrual period. And that should make sense, because if she's pregnant and an embryo is implanted there, the lining of the uterus is going to stay thickened and enriched. The entire time of pregnancy, it's never going to be shed. The menstrual period stops for all of pregnancy, and often even after pregnancy, because there's an embryo growing there. There's a fetus. If the lining of the uterus were shed while the embryo is attached, it wouldn't survive. So that's why the menstrual period stops when pregnancy starts. Here is what you're going to be doing in a lab when you're going to graph some of this data. But if we look at the reproductive cycle, we can see the levels of these different hormones are here. And we can see they fluctuate throughout the reproductive cycle. But when they peak together here, when estrogen, LH, and FSH peak, that's the signal for ovulation to happen. That's when the egg is released into the oviduct. That's when it can be fertilized. After that, the follicle breaks down, and if there is no fertilized egg present, that's when the lining of the uterus is shed. Any questions about?
So, you said that if there's no fertilized egg present, that's when the uterus will shed.
Yes.
So how come when, I don't know if you can answer this or if it's like.
Go for it. No, go for it.
But how come when women are on their menstrual cycle, how come it's like a current, what's the word I want to use? Continuous,
Like,
flow.
you mean for a long period of time or just during? So it doesn't happen like all at once. That sort of as these hormones drop off, and if there is no embryo there, sort of the lining breaks down gradually over time. And are you meaning if it's a long period of time, like a flow of blood for a period of time that's longer than just the menstrual period?
I'm meaning because normally a woman knows when she's on her period when,
Yep.
blood appears.
Yes.
So does this happen before, and the menstrual period is when the lining is coming?
Yeah, sort of it all happens at once. So and then it can be irregular as well. Like sometimes a woman may have like spotting and maybe discharging some blood like at the beginning of the cycle and then during actual menstruation. It varies widely and sometimes takes a long time. Sometimes a woman can have a very irregular cycle. And do you know what one of the treatments they do if a woman has a very irregular cycle or they have their menstrual period for a long time? Do you know like one of the treatments they might be? Yeah, because what is birth control? So if you take a birth control pill, if a person takes a birth control pill, like what is it actually? What are you taking? Yeah, it's hormones. It's progesterone. It's these hormones we're talking about. That's what birth control pills are made of. There are these hormones, and what do they do? So not only do they, so what do they prevent from happening? Well, let's be more specific. So what needs to stop in order for a woman to avoid pregnancy? Not menstruation. Ovulation. right? Ovulation is what needs to be stopped generally in order for birth control to work. If a woman's not ovulating, then she can't become pregnant. But besides stopping ovulation, birth control pills, like usually it's estrogen and progesterone, or sometimes one, it also regulates the cycle. Like when a woman, so birth control pills have a variety, there's a bunch of different pills. So birth control, a package of birth control pills has like 28 different pills. And each of them have different levels of hormones in them. And some of them have no hormones in them. So when a woman takes those day after, you have to take it each day, most types. And it's basically regulating those hormone cycles. Because sometimes a woman's body itself is not producing those hormones predictably to have a reliable menstrual cycle, by taking these pills each day, could sort of get back to sort of a more typical shape of those hormone levels in the blood, and that can regulate the menstrual cycle and also prevent ovulation. So birth control pills can be used for different reasons, not only for contraception, so that person doesn't become pregnant, but also to regulate the menstrual period, to reduce the amount of bleeding, to do a whole bunch of different things. Doctors can use sort of these hormones. Sometimes, yeah, some that's like an advertising. That's like in their marketing to women, is that this contraception you won't get your period anymore. And so that's sometimes as a benefit that you don't have to go through this each one. There's we'll talk more about, we'll talk about it as we get to contraception a little later. Any other questions about male or female reproductive systems? Okay. 37 minutes.